Welcome everyone to Education for Employment's Resilience Series event. We have a very special guest today, CNN's Chief International Correspondent, Clarissa Ward. This is a rare and super exciting opportunity to talk with Clarissa about her new memoir, On All Fronts, The Education of a Journalist, and to get her insights on how to unlock potential from the front lines of development and empowerment in the Middle East and North Africa. We have over 400 guests today, including youth from across the region, universities, business leaders, fellow nonprofits, EFE supporters and partners, volunteers, board, and staff members. Also welcome to the Show I Can entrepreneurship event participants from Yemen. We'd love your engagement today, so please submit your questions for Clarissa in the Q&A as we go along, and we'll turn to those in the second part of our session. For those of you who are new to EFE, we are the leading nonprofit that trains youth in the Middle East and North Africa and connects them to employment. Youth are the region's greatest asset. And we believe that every young person, every youth in the Middle East and North Africa should have the opportunity to build futures, dignity, and hope through employment. This pivotal region is the hardest place on earth for young people to get their first job. Nearly 1/3 are out of work. And COVID job losses have disproportionately impacted youth and women even further. At EFE, we have connected more than 111,000 youth to the world of work in partnership with 3,000 businesses. And we've also supported thousands of young entrepreneurs. Today, CNN's Clarissa Ward joins us to speak about her new memoir that details her career as one of the world's top conflict reporters, and how with her deep empathy and courage, she finds a way to tell the hardest stories. Clarissa speaks Arabic, has lived in Baghdad, Beirut, and Syria, in addition to traveling across the Middle East and North Africa to report, including Egypt, Gaza, Afghanistan, and Yemen. She has worked at more news networks than many: Fox, CBS, ABC, and now CNN. Clarissa has received 7 Emmys, 2 Peabodys, and countless other awards for her reporting. Welcome, Clarissa.
Hi, thank you so much for having me. Thank you for such a generous introduction.
Well, it's really great to have you with us. And I just want to jump right into it. I think this is on many people's minds. Why did you decide to risk your life to become a war reporter?
So the sort of seminal moment for me was 9/11, because up until that point, I was studying comparative literature at Yale University. I was following world news, but I won't say that I was totally absorbed by it. But in that one moment, I understood that I had been essentially asleep at the wheel, that I had been missing out on some very important tensions that were bubbling beneath the surface. And I felt a strong sense of compulsion that I wanted to understand better how this happened, why this happened, who was responsible for it happening. And more than that, I really felt like I wanted to get to the root of something that I saw as being a contributing factor in the sort of attacks of 9/11, which was miscommunication and dehumanization, misunderstanding of the other. So basically, in that moment, I decided, I was 21. I didn't really know exactly how I was going to do it yet, but I knew that I wanted to go to the front lines on the furthest corners of the earth to try to act as a kind of a witness, but also as a diplomat, in a sense, shuttling between 2 different worlds and hopefully representing my world to another world, and bringing something of that world home to our viewers as well. And that's really how it started. It then developed into something a little bit different, I think, more along the lines of bearing witness. But 9/11 is definitely what made me decide to do this work.
And Clarissa, when you started working, you not only covered the war, but you lived through it. I mean, you lived in the region, you experienced it, and that compassion really comes through in your book, the compassion of your reporting. You talk about how it's both a blessing and a curse. Can you tell us more about that?
So first of all, I would just say that, one of my pet peeves that we see a lot more today, unfortunately, in the news for a number of reasons, is fewer people deployed to actually go and live in these different countries and different regions. And for me, how on earth could I cover the war in Iraq if I wasn't actually living there, if I wasn't trying to study the language, if I wasn't trying to understand the culture, if I wasn't reading up on the history, if I wasn't talking to the people every day. Because fundamentally, when you boil it down, my job is to talk to people, hear what they have to say, learn about their experiences, and then project that to a broader audience. So I have always felt that it's crucial to actually, and whether it's been in Russia or China or Beirut or Baghdad or any of these places, I've always elected to go and live and immerse myself in the country or in the culture. Now, it can be a blessing and a curse, because a blessing for the obvious reasons, what an incredible privilege to live in different countries and understand the world in a much more profound way. A curse because sometimes it can be confusing, and you realize that a lot of things that you thought you understood about your own country and the way you're perceived in the world were not true, about your own country's role in the world and role in foreign affairs and the impact of your country's actions on other countries. So I think when you start out and you do this and you're really young, there's a lot of walls that come smashing down. Ultimately, I think it's hugely important for those walls to come smashing down, not just for journalists, but for people all over the world. We need to be looking outwards. We need to be engaged with other cultures. We need to be learning from them, not just because it gives us the privilege of learning, but also we learn about ourselves in the process.
So Clarissa, how do you actually do that, especially for the many young people on the line who are maybe starting out their careers? How do you immerse yourself in a different culture and not get defensive and stay open and really learn and share? How do you do that?
I mean, first of all, I think it's a process, right? It's not something that happens overnight. And I can't claim that I'm perfect at it either. I'm not. You know, you very generously say I speak Arabic. I've tried hard. I speak conversational Arabic. It's certainly not perfect. I wish I could speak like beautiful Fusha, like classical Arabic, instead of kind of the Shami Derish that I speak. But anyway, I think that language is a big start, but sometimes, you know, languages might not be your forte. It's not the end of the world. It doesn't mean you can't go and learn about a place just because you don't speak the language. I think a bigger part of it probably is about leaving your preconceptions at the door, leaving your judgments at the door. That doesn't mean that you don't hold true to your values. Of course you do. But when you go into somebody else's home and you sit with them and you eat with them and you learn from them and you watch them, you have to do that with a really open mind. You have to be willing to see history from their perspective, see the present from their perspective, and try to learn and understand why they see the world the way they do, even if you don't fundamentally share that worldview. Sometimes we have a tendency nowadays, I think, to view listening or normalizing the other as something that's dangerous or shouldn't be done or weakness. And to me, it actually comes from a position of strength to be able to say, I am comfortable enough with who I am and what my values are to be able to be open to your experience and to learn about it and to immerse myself in it.
I think that's such an important message with all the divisiveness in the world, and we don't have to travel to other countries to experience that. Just going back for a minute, you talked about immersing yourself um, with other people and other cultures to cover the stories. That must take a major emotional toll. And your book talks about the trauma involved in war reporting that is sort of taboo among war reporters, but you really put it out there in your book. Can you tell us more about that?
So I think it's most pronounced, certainly in my personal experience with Syria and my coverage of the Syrian civil war. And a big part of that, you know, we're just talking about this idea of immersion. Normally, as a war correspondent, whether you're in Libya or Iraq or Gaza or wherever you are, you have your hotel that you stay in and you go to the front lines every day. And then at night, you go back to your hotel. And it still might be dangerous and difficult. I'm not saying it's like you're staying at the Ritz and watching, you know, Tom Hanks movies. Of course not. But still, you have a level of distance, if only for a few hours from the conflict. You have a moment to be among your other colleagues, to decompress, to work on getting your story out, or whatever it might be. In Syria, that wasn't possible. Particularly if you were covering the rebel side, as I was. You had to live with these people. and living with them and living through them and vicariously experiencing the death, the trauma. You would go out in battle and see a young man killed, and then go back to the house where you were staying and find out that it was the brother of the man whose home you were staying in. And you're in the room when the women find out and are pulling their hair out and grieving and wailing, and the body of the man is being held for the night in the garage next to where you're sleeping. And so that is a whole new level, even for the most intrepid of war correspondents, of intimacy with death, of intimacy with people's grief and with people's trauma. And I think that, because our job is to essentially to bear witness, it provided, in the case of Syria, a unique opportunity to do the kind of storytelling that really makes you proud, that is really impactful, that is really compelling, that is urgent. But of course, there is also a price to pay emotionally for that. You don't witness that kind of heartache and violence and bloodshed and horror and not take a little bit of it home with you, not absorb some of it. And so, one of the most challenging components of this job, I would say, is not so much learning to deal with the trauma in the moment, because in the moment there's a lot of adrenaline and you've got your mission, and your mission is to get the best story you can on air. But when you come home, when the adrenaline starts to fade, when you have a moment to absorb, to assess, when you're trying to have relations with other people who didn't share that combat experience with you, whether it's friends, family, and you're feeling detached and numb, those are the moments where it can be really challenging. And it's absolutely crucial that anyone who wants to keep doing this work in the long term finds a way to navigate those really tough transitions.
And when you're in the field and you're really chasing those stories, one of the things in your book that you said as an editor sends you a reminder, cannot file if dead, and sort of pulls you back.
Yeah, because there's always an impulse, right? There's the metaphor of the frog, and you put a frog in boiling water and it will jump right out. But if you put a frog in cold water and then slowly heat it up, the frog will stay in the water until it's boiling, because the heat is incremental. And the same thing can happen when you're in a war zone, which is that in the beginning, you're very scared, you're very nervous, you're on high alert, your guard is up, you're constantly strategizing. But then you spend a week or 2 weeks and you start to get used to it, and you start to become desensitized to the risks. And that is a moment where you have to be really careful, because it's easy to get sloppy. It's easy to get complacent. And that editor saying that it really articulates that it's one thing to take risks to do this work. And I think we all do that and we're all proud of it. It's another thing to be so irresponsible that you could get yourself killed, because that doesn't serve anybody's interest, not the people whose stories you're telling, not the people who you work for, not obviously your friends and family. And so there is a huge amount of responsibility that comes with this. You cannot be complacent about your security. We spend months preparing for these kinds of trips. We're constantly doing training. We're constantly working with risk consultants. And that is a luxury, because most people who are living in these war zones all the time don't have access to anything like that kind of privilege. So I feel very strongly that it's important to be constantly mindful about your security and the security of people who are working with you.
And Clarissa, people in those situations are astonishingly resilient and positive. And your book talks about people's small acts of kindness. And in my own travels to Yemen, Gaza, Afghanistan, this really stands out, the bright spots, the spirit of the people. Can you give us some examples of those small acts of kindness that have really stood out for you?
I mean, this is what kills me sometimes, because these small acts of kindness are what shapes your understanding of a people, a conflict, a culture, but they never make it onto the evening news. And it's so important. It's part of why I wrote the book. All these incredible lives that I have had the privilege of intersecting with, and I wanted to write a thank you letter to them. And whether it's someone like my beloved driver Ayman in Syria, who very sadly was killed in a Russian airstrike on a hospital, but he was driving me into Aleppo, And it was during some of the worst violence there, and it was nonstop artillery shells falling, and we were sitting in the car, and he could see that I was sick with fear. I was really so scared, and he was trying to chat to me to make me feel calmer and to make me laugh, and he just gave me some chocolate, a little bit of chocolate, and I wasn't hungry at all, but it was such a kind thing to do, and it provided just this nice distraction, and I ate the chocolate, and it just, I was so grateful for it. I found it profoundly moving. And it's funny, like another food one, but when we were living in this house in Syria in Idlib, and the father's brother had been killed in battle, and the next morning, and the whole family was desperately sad. I mean, heartbroken. And they were up all night reciting the Quran over his body, and everyone was wailing, and it was heartbreaking. And I couldn't believe it. I woke up the next morning, and the woman of the house brought down this huge tray with, bread and za'atar and like herbs and olive oil and boiled eggs and tomato. And I was like, on what planet does someone find the strength and generosity in their heart in the midst of their own grief to get up and make a beautiful breakfast for their foreign guests? That to me is speaks volumes about a culture, about a people, about a place. And so, and you'll find in my book there's countless examples like this, not only in the Middle East, also in in Russia, China, other places I've lived as well. But those are the moments that, the reason you do this job, the thing that keeps you going. It's not about being attracted to violence or to adrenaline or excitement. It's about the people, and it's about the profound connection that you can form with people from a million miles away through these small acts of kindness.
I think that's so important, and it breaks through the biases and stereotypes that are so negative about youth and women and the Middle East in general.
Oh,
And it's just it's astonishing. I want to read a passage from your book that relates to this. You write, let's see, you write, how many times had I been reminded that people are people? There's a shared human experience, no matter how different our societies, that connects us, that beyond the geopolitics of war and the brutality and the clashes of cultures, people are people.
yeah. I mean, and I can't tell you. I believe that so. I know it. It's not even up for debate. I have seen it with my own eyes. And you talked about the biases and misperceptions, and it drives me crazy. Some of the ideas that people who haven't traveled to the Middle East have about that region. And it's based out of ignorance and maybe some, too many Hollywood movies. I don't know. I find it deeply distressing. And I feel like part of my job is to explain to people just how wrong they are and how much they're missing out on.
You say that sometimes this doesn't make it onto the news. So tell us more, what does it take to create a story, and what does it take to actually get it onto the TV news? And why aren't more of these kinds of stories getting onto the TV news?
Yeah. So, I mean, first of all, you have to understand with news is that people have a limited attention span. So, depending on who you work for, you might get 2.5 minutes to tell a story on a sort of daily basis. That's not a lot of time. In 2.5 minutes, you maybe have time to cover the basics of what the conflict or the story is about, who the players are, interview with someone on each side, or if you're on the ground, interview with the people around you. And that's it. You're done. I'm very privileged now to be in a position at CNN where, I'm able to do these larger enterprise projects, like when I embedded with the Taliban last year, and I was given 12 minutes for that story, which is more, it's closer to what a 60-minute story is. And in 12 minutes, you can start to sort of touch a little bit on some of that nuance that you're referring to. But basically, there's a reason so many people want to work in documentary film, which is that even though there isn't a lot of money in it, if you are a little bit more sophisticated in terms of your understanding or knowledge about some of these regions and places, documentary film is the only place that you can really start to get that nuance in and really get a picture of a place or a people. So we do the best that we can with the limited tools that we have and the limited time that we're given. And the other thing that's important to remember, CNN is different. We have a global audience, but if I'm talking to an American audience, I have to talk to them in language that they understand. I have to tell them a story in a way that is familiar to them in order for them to really process it. And so sometimes I know from experience, people in other parts of the world might look at the story and say, oh, that's simplistic, or, that's only telling this much of the story. But you have to keep in mind always when you're a journalist, who is my audience? Who am I explaining this to? What is the best way to do that? What's the most powerful way to do that? For me personally, it's all about having great characters and great moments. And I try to have those small moments in every piece where it is you just connecting with someone for a moment, having a conversation with someone, having the viewer feel like they're right there with you on the journey.
And what's an untold story, Clarissa, that you really wanted to get onto the news, but it didn't make it? I'm sure there are many.
I mean, there are so many. I'm lucky, as I said, I'm at a point in my career where usually if I'm that passionate about a story, it's going to get on. But I would like to see a lot more stories about what's happening with the Uyghur Muslims in China. I would like to see more coverage of the democracy revolution that's being brutally quashed in Belarus on Russia's doorstep. I would like to see more, or I would have liked to have seen more about the war between Armenia and Azerbaijan playing out in Nagorno-Karabakh. So these are just like a few samples. I would like to see way more stories from Africa, which are, basically, and South America. There are a lot of blind spots at the moment. And that's because you can't really fight whatever the news cycle is. And people do have a limited capacity for absorbing this kind of information. So the news cycle usually has 3 or 4, maybe 5 stories. That is what's at the forefront of people's minds. And then a lot of those other stories, unfortunately, you really have to find a way to hook an American audience or hook an international audience to make it relevant to them.
Well, thankfully, given your position, I think we will be seeing more and more of those kinds of stories. So it is really, really great and a testament to how important it is that people with that your kind of compassion and interest in others get to the positions that you're in. I'd like to just shift to talk about a set of topics that are really closely linked to education for employment's mission.
Mm-hmm.
At EFE, we speak a lot with youth about the importance of starting their first job and just getting their foot in the door, even if it's not their dream job. So can you share with us a little bit how you got your start and how you moved from your internship and your first job to your dream job as CNN's Chief International Correspondent?
I mean, I think it's so important for everybody who this is relevant to, who's watching or listening. Your first job is never going to feel like you've made it and like you are where you want to be. And in fact, quite the reverse. Sometimes you might be feeling real panic or anxiety that you've made the wrong choice. This isn't the career for you. If you're like me and you went to college and people kept telling you the world's your oyster, the world's your oyster, and then suddenly you're out there in the world and you realize, yeah, the world's your oyster, but the world also doesn't really care about you or need you. It's up to you to work out how to make your mark and get where you want to be. So for me, I had done an internship with CNN in Moscow. I desperately wanted to start working for CNN in New York. They didn't have any availability and they said I was going to have to wait 3 months for a job, which for me felt like, forever. So I took a job that was offered to me on the spot on the Fox News overnight assignment desk. Okay. There is no lower rung on the totem pole than that job. Okay. That is like the worst of the worst jobs in TV news. The hours are terrible. To be honest, I didn't really want to work for Fox, but they gave me a job. They offered it to me on the spot and I knew that I could learn. And boy, did I learn, because even if you're starting at the very bottom, you're immersed. Look around. Don't be afraid to ask people questions. Find a mentor. Find someone who will tell you about what they're doing and why they're doing it. Read every email that's going out to the company. Try to get your head around, how does this whole process work? So for me, it was like, how do things go from I get a phone call or I see a wire cross saying Saddam Hussein has been found in northern Iraq in a foxhole near Tikrit, and how does that then translate into me reading that, verifying it, writing up a wire on it for internal consumption, deploying a team to where they need to be, getting that team live up, and then having a live shot on, and there's like 10 things that need to happen in order for that sequence to be complete. And that's what you learn. You learn the kind of the sausage making of it. It's not the glamorous bit. It's not the exciting bit. You're not where you want to be. You're making mistakes. You're feeling like an idiot constantly because you're learning all the time. But all of that is okay because it teaches you humility, and hopefully it gives you a dose of something that's super essential to anything you want to do in life, which is curiosity. You've got to have passion and curiosity. You have to constantly want to know, but what about this? But what about that? And how could I do this? And what if I did that? And if you don't naturally feel that energy, that curiosity, and that passion, then it may just be that it's not really the right career for you, or you just might be wired differently. Not everybody is designed to be, a careerist at all. So for me, that's how I went about it. And then after doing like a year and a half on the overnight assignment desk, I was willing to take the risk of quitting my job, moving to the Middle East, which I didn't know, setting up shop in Beirut as a freelance producer, and the rest was history for me. I was lucky I could keep going back and forth to Baghdad because there was a war and an occupation going on there, and not many journalists wanted to go anymore because it was so dangerous. But that's what you do. You seize the opportunity. You look around, you see where there's an opening for you, and then you do everything that you possibly can to make sure that you're the one who gets in there.
It also feels like you had very clear goals for yourself. And one of the goals you talk about in your book was to get in front of the camera.
Yeah.
But you didn't feel you had the experience or the confidence to push for it,
Yeah.
which is impossible to understand now given where you are. But you were at a certain point, that's where you were. And you
Yeah.
talk about the role of mentors in
Yes.
helping you get in front of the camera. Tell us about that.
So, I mean, I don't know how you guys all feel about this, but for me, certainly when I was 22, 23, 24, 25, 26, 27, I mean, for quite a while, I didn't feel confident at all because I knew that there was still so much I needed to learn. I didn't know fully how to do the job. So I had all these dreams and I had a real sense of conviction about what it was that I was meant to do. But I was still really unclear on how to get there and how to do it, and how not to feel silly doing it. And the most important thing that you can do, and it doesn't really matter what industry you're working in, is find people who inspire you, who are doing the job in an exemplary way that you would like to replicate, and talk to them, email them, ask them a few questions. I get emails and messages from, aspiring journalists almost every day, and I answer every single one because personally I feel it's really important to pay it forward, and also because I feel like we're in a moment where it's like we need an awesome next generation of journalists. So I feel like it's my duty in a sense to help in facilitating that. But for anyone in any industry, you've got to have a mentor. You've got to have someone you can look up to and learn from. And in my experience, most people, not everyone, but there are many people who are really receptive to wanting to share the knowledge that they've learned along the way. You can also get it from books. Like if you wanted to be a journalist, you would benefit from reading my book because you would understand the journey that I went on and you'd learn from it and you'd be able to cherry pick which elements of it might be helpful for your journey.
And how does a young person go from sending that email to actually getting a mentor?
Yeah. I mean, sometimes you just have to be like really persuasive and persistent. Sometimes you have to be willing to, it doesn't necessarily have to be immediately, how can you help me? Right? That's what you're saying to the mentor. It can be, how can I help you? Hey, I know you have 1,000 things going on. How can I help you? Can I do some research for you? Can I, book some tickets for you, help you get a visa? Can I, whatever it might be. People tend to be very receptive to that if you're offering to help them in your free time or in your extra time. Or if you know that someone is really interested in a certain conflict, or it doesn't even matter if they're really interested in a sports team, start a conversation with them. Show them that you've learned something about whatever it is that they're really interested in. A big part of the world that we live in, rightly or wrongly today, is about having good relationships with people and being able to make friends. And that's going to be hugely valuable to you, frankly, at any stage in your career.
And Clarissa, I've got more questions, but there are a couple coming in that I want to pivot to because they do relate a bit to this. And I don't think male journalists are ever asked what it's like to be a man and reporting in the field. But since you have this topic in your book, it's fair game. What was it like being a woman in the middle of the reporting that you did in these dangerous areas? And were you exposed to dangers that you would have avoided if you were a man? This is a question coming in from Egypt.
Yeah, well, thank you very much. I think it's one of the real misconceptions, particularly with the Middle East and, the role of women. And there's a very strong belief that women are subjugated, women are treated badly. And my experience has been very different from that, which is not to say that there aren't problems, although frankly, you can argue that there are problems in most societies with the role of women and how they're often treated. But my personal experience working in the Middle East has been that being a woman is a tremendous asset, actually. And I'll tell you why. Number one, the joke in Afghanistan was always that female Western journalists, we were honorary men, right? And that meant that we were allowed to sit with the men. And I'm talking in conservative societies, which are largely segregated, where men and women do not sit with each other unless they're family. So I could sit with the men and, drink chai with them and ask them questions and listen to them talk. And then I could also go and sit with the women and the children in their part of the house. And let me ask you this: how can you do your job as a journalist if you're a male Western journalist? How can you do your job if you can't tell the stories of 50% of the population? If you have no access to women and to that part of the household, when they offer a completely different perspective on what's going on, they often have a very different take on a conflict, on politics, on geopolitics, and their voices are really important. They need to be heard, even if they're not willing to be on camera. It informs my reporting. It makes it clear to me. It gives me a wider, broader picture of what people are experiencing and going through. Secondly, I have found in the Middle East that I'm often treated with curiosity and maybe wariness even, but I have almost always been treated with enormous respect. And particularly if I'm willing to go the extra mile, if I'm in a very conservative society, I am willing to honor those traditional norms. And I will sit with the women. I don't have a problem with that. I will wear hijab if it's appropriate for me to wear hijab. Just the same as, people are like, how could you wear a headscarf? This is like, outrageous. It's not good for women's rights. I'm like, if you're invited to Buckingham Palace for tea with the Queen, would you show up in ripped jeans, or would you wear what's appropriate in that context to wear for a tea party at Buckingham Palace? And this is how I feel about dressing conservatively in more conservative parts of the Middle East. I don't view that as being weakness on my part at all. So, and then the third thing I would say, just from a purely strategic point of view, is because you're seen maybe as less of a threat than some of your Western colleagues are. And I'm talking in like real war zones here, right? I'm talking about in northern Syria during the heart of the civil war. I'm not talking about hanging around in Cairo, okay? And like, that's a different setting. I'm talking about some of the most intense conflicts. But as a woman, I can pretend to be asleep in the back of the car and drive through a checkpoint, right? No one's really going to look twice at me. They don't care. So I have always found it to be an asset. There are situations, particularly in other places in the world, where you are more vulnerable, obviously, to things like sexual assault. I have also female colleagues who have been assaulted in the Middle East as well. I have female colleagues who've been assaulted in America too. So there is an undeniable reality that all of us women, and frankly, not just journalists, deal with in any place that we go to, which is that we can be or often are more vulnerable to sexual assault. But with the exception of that, more broadly, I would say in my experience, I am it's a great privilege to be a woman in the places I travel in, and I view it as an asset.
Again, I think that really shatters biases and stereotypes about what it means to be a woman professional in the Middle East and North Africa, that you sometimes have greater access and that you are able to tell the other half of the story. I think that's really powerful. We have another question on that theme from a senior professional in finance in the US who's asking, how have you seen the role of women in journalism, especially international journalism, evolve over your career?
It's such a good question. And it's when I started out as a producer in Baghdad in 2005, the correspondent in the newsroom, who shall remain nameless, used to jokingly refer to me as sugar tits. Okay. So like just to give you a sense of the world that used to be for, and that wasn't even the worst of it. Okay. I came in late. This is in 2005. For women doing this kind of job in the 1990s and the 1980s, they were experiencing all sorts of like thoroughly inappropriate behavior on a pretty much consistent level. And they were often the only women doing that kind of work. Now, fast forward to 2014, and let's look at the women who are covering Syria, whether it's me, whether it's Arwa Damon, whether it's Rania Abu Zaid, whether it's Liz Sly, whether it's Anne Bernard. I mean, I could go on and on and on. Women have done a tremendous job of covering not only Syria, but so many conflicts. I have dozens of female colleagues now doing this work. And I think that that glass ceiling has definitely been shattered. You will still invariably find yourself on assignments where you're the only woman. It happens. But so much improvement has been made. And you won't find, I don't think, people calling you sugar tits in the newsroom anymore. And that is a good thing. And I think we can all embrace that. We can do better. We can definitely do better. We still don't have enough female camerawomen, camera operators. That is still a largely male career path. And so obviously would like to see more women doing that job, because when you do have all female teams, as I often have worked with, it's amazing the kind of work you can do and the access you can get, particularly if you want to tell women's stories, which I think, as we've just said, is so vitally important.
Clarissa, the number of questions have just doubled, so I'm going to keep rolling with the questions coming in. A young woman in the region has asked, how can you manage to handle your work-life balance?
You're assuming that I have managed to handle it. I think one of the biggest myths that we tell each other as women is that you can have it all. And you sort of can have it all, but you can't have it at the same time. And I am married. I have 2 children now, and it's a real struggle to make it all work. And I'm so passionate about my career. I really have no desire to dial back at all in my job, although I respect women who do decide to do that. So it's always a juggling act, and things are always dropping on the floor. And I can't tell you, I've been in the middle of Syria with Turkish artillery falling down, and I'm on a satellite phone with my son's nanny trying to remind her about the play date he has that day. I mean, it's completely absurd. But if you want to have that really kind of present experience of being a mother, and you want to have the career, then you sort of figure out a way to try and do both. And the only thing I would say to women who feel that they have to just only immerse themselves in their career, what I talk a lot about something called filling the tank, which is when I am at home and I have come back from a war zone, I have to fill the tank. I am so emotionally bereft and drained and exhausted physically as well. I need that time with my children, my family, eating well, sleeping well, being surrounded by love. That is what fills the tank and allows me to go back out there and do that work again and keep telling those stories, which I feel so passionate about. But conversely, if I'm sitting at home with my kids endlessly, and this is different for every mother, I start to feel drained as well. I start to feel bored. I start to feel restless. I need to go out there and do my work and have my mind set alight and feel that flicker of passion and excitement. And I'm filling the tank in a different way. And that way, when I come home, I'm so much more present with my children. And it doesn't necessarily entail travel. It can just be, what I'm doing now. Even I'll get off this call and I'll feel invigorated by this conversation, and I'll go and be with my kids and really be present with them in a way that maybe if I'd spent like an hour and a half kind of surfing the web or whatever, or all day with them, I wouldn't have that level of presence, of energy. So I think the bottom line is you have to make it work for you, but there needs to be a balance because one side feeds the other and vice versa.
We have a question from a young man in the Middle East who's saying that, believes very much in opportunity for females, but is also noticing that more and more of the universities and classes, the attendees are women. And so what about opportunities that can be offered to young men?
Yeah. Well, first of all, I mean, I'm glad that you agree that it's so exciting that women are being offered more opportunities, and they are, by and large now, the majority in some countries, I think in Saudi Arabia, of university attendant, which is like wild, and wildly exciting and hugely important, because you're talking about unlocking the potential of societies. Again, if only 50% of your society is really engaged with the sort of with work essentially, then that's really limiting your country's potential. So in terms of opportunities for young men, for me, honestly, and doing this work, I don't see the difference, as in, like, if someone has the goods, if they have the commitment, if they've done the work, if they have the passion and the curiosity and the drive and the knowledge, it doesn't matter to me if you're a man or a woman. And I would like to think that in most places that holds true. So I think the most important is not to be threatened by the sort of increasing empowerment of your female colleagues, but definitely you could see it as some healthy competition. It used to be a bit more of a boys club, and now there's a lot of ladies in that club too, and you might just have to up your game a little bit.
Fair enough. Another question from a young person in the region. If I don't like what I'm doing, and at the same time, I don't know what I want to do, at this moment, do I take the risk and leave my job and try a lot of things, even if I fail a lot of times, or shouldn't I?
So that's a really good question. And first of all, I should say that having a vocation or a calling like I had with journalism after 9/11 is a blessing. And the vast majority of people don't have that necessarily. They don't have this epiphany moment where it's like, this is what I must do with the rest of my life. And I think sometimes we tend in the West to project an image of work as being kind of romantic, and it's a calling and it's something you feel passion for. And that's wonderful, and that's a luxury. But there is also another side to this, which is that work is work, right? Work is about feeding your family. Work is about, doing something, yes, that engages you and excites you, but also making sure that the bills get paid. And if you feel strongly that there is an opportunity that you want to seize upon, then of course, if you're able to make that work financially, you should pursue that. But at the same time, don't be too down on yourself, just because you don't necessarily have an all-consuming passion for your work. You can find passion in other places in your life as well. Not everybody loves their job more than anything. I know plenty of people who hate their jobs, and I wouldn't say that that's a positive thing either, but I'm just saying it doesn't have to be a vocation.
Clarissa, we've now quadrupled the question, so I'm going to keep I'm going to keep asking them. What was your favorite Middle Eastern experience?
Oh my gosh. I mean, it's impossible to say. There's like so many, whether it's, my first vacation in Damascus back in 2005, and wandering around the old souk and hanging out in the Umayyad Mosque and eating shish taouk sandwiches with patata ma'aliya and toum. Oh my gosh, so delicious. Or whether it's living in Beirut and, going to the beach and dancing on the tabletops, or visiting Petra in Jordan. And so many incredible experiences in Iraq, eating kuzi, which is not for everyone, but I happen to like it. I think with the Middle East, for me, what it boils down to is two things. Food is a big part of it, and hospitality. I would go so far as to say, having lived in many different countries and traveled to endless countries, there is no region in the world that does hospitality like the Middle East. There is no other culture that I have been to where people will literally be like, come and sleep in my house. Of course. You'll take the bed. I'll sleep on the floor. I'll serve you food. I mean, like, what? I mean, that's just so alien
So true.
to what we experience, particularly in the West and in the US. And boy, it's such a beautiful thing. And that level of humility. And I think we can learn so much from that. So, yes, I'm very blessed to have spent a lot of time in the Middle East, and I've had so many beautiful experiences there.
And on that line, I'm going to sneak in one of my questions, which is what is one of your favorite Arabic phrases, especially that brings you hope and light in some of those darker moments?
I mean, there's so many, right? Because like Arabic is such a rich language, and even like the way people talk, and if you say thank you to someone, they say ala rasi, like from my head, or you say sahtain to someone in Lebanon, meaning like good appetite, and they say al albek, like to your heart. I mean, it's there's so much beauty in the language, and so much richness, and so much meaning built into so many karama, right? The idea of dignity, which is such a huge thing in the Middle East. But the phrase that I chose is yadun wahda la tusaffik, right? One hand doesn't clap. And I think that's so important. Obviously, it's like similar to two heads are better than one, but the idea that on your own, you can't achieve it all, right? You need others to join the fold. And I think in general, the Middle East understands, and I don't like to make generalizations like the Middle East. Obviously, every country is different, but what I do see across many of those countries is a real spirit of community and a real appreciation of family. That is like really been lost a lot, certainly in the U.S. And it's the basis and the fabric of society in the Middle East. So that's why I chose that phrase. But even in general, everything from Allahu alam and inshallah khair. There's so many like small, or even yani. What other word? There is no equivalent. Or yalla. Anyway, we could do this all day, but suffice it to say, it's a very rich and beautiful language, and I feel very privileged to speak it even just shwaya, yani.
And as you say, there's no translation for some of this, and the pure spirit is amazing. I've got a comment and a question here. The comment is, in the midst of the current events, the people of the Middle East need to meet normal American families and get a more humane image of Americans, as much as Americans need to learn about the Middle East. That's actually coming from the region. And the question is, how many Syrian refugees will be able to go back home?
So the comment is spot on. I could not agree more. I can't tell you the number of times I have heard a sort of casual racist comment or something ignorant being said about Muslims, and it makes me want to cry, because it's not based, Americans are not bad people. They're wonderful people, but they are not always really exposed to the rest of the world. They don't often travel to all these different places in the world. And so a lot of the ideas that they have about the rest of the world are based on stereotypes, or they're just incorrect. And the only way you can improve that is, I think, to a certain level you can in Hollywood, by having more responsible casting and more responsible storylines that give a better and more truthful sense of a different culture if you're representing them in a movie or in a TV show. Also through the work that people like me do, trying to rise above some of these stereotypes and have a much more nuanced and accurate and truthful approach. But also through direct interaction. There's no substitute for that. Whether that's traveling to the US or traveling to the Middle East if you're American, whether that's chatting on Skype or on FaceTime, forming a sort of language partnership, whatever it might be, that is really the most crucial weapon in terms of fighting ignorance, fighting stereotypes, and fighting misunderstandings about different cultures. In terms of answering the second question about Syrian refugees, I mean, you're talking about roughly half of Syria has been displaced from their homes, and certainly 7 million are refugees. How can they go back to Syria now with the status quo? For many of them who are involved in the opposition or supported the opposition in some way or related to someone who supported, it's impossible. They're going to go back and they could face imprisonment, torture, death, or all kinds of retribution. And Syria is a broken country. And how can you rebuild it when the man who broke it is still in power? Even if you support Bashar al-Assad, I think that you could probably acknowledge that it's very difficult for people who lost children, who lost sons and daughters and wives and husbands, and who were tortured and imprisoned. It's very difficult for them to go back to living under that regime. So I would argue that until there's some kind of a political transition in that country, you're not going to see a lot of refugees return. And until you see a huge amount of money from the international community being injected into that country in order to facilitate the kind of rebuilding that needs to happen. But that cash injection is not going to happen as long as Bashar al-Assad is still in power.
Two comments from Palestine. From Palestine, Gaza, big thanks for your programs because it makes a big difference in my life. Another one, why don't you visit us in Palestine, Gaza? I'll be your tour guide.
Well, first of all, I'm very privileged to have visited Gaza twice. And I have loved it on both occasions, even though I have to say it's been under really, really trying circumstances during some pretty intense military activity. I absolutely think that Gaza is beautiful. I had the best knafe of my life there. And the ocean, and listen, what's happening in Gaza is heartbreaking on so many levels. There's endless potential. I have worked with so many Palestinians who are brilliant, who are committed, who speak many languages, who are curious, who are open-minded, and they don't have the opportunities right now that they should have. And I hope that will continue to change through the work that groups like EFE do, and hopefully through some of the reporting that I do as well.
And linked to that, EFE's founder and chairman, Ron Bruder, has a question for you. Well, first, he thanks you for all that you're doing. He says 9/11 was a seminal moment for him as well, leading him to create EFE. And he asks, how can we best support your work?
Oh, hi, Ron. Thank you. Thank you both for this opportunity and also for creating EFE. And it's funny that we both had that response, in a sense, to 9/11. Listen, I think that it's not so much about supporting my work per se, as it is about supporting the work of journalists more broadly. We're in a very strange time at the moment where the mainstream media is under constant attack, where the very idea of truth is being called into question. We are being bombarded daily with misinformation and, more concerningly, with disinformation. And so often we hear the media and journalists being disparaged, being categorized as an enemy of the people. And that has a really, really chilling effect, not just on Western journalists, but frankly, more on local journalists, especially if they're working in countries where authoritarians are now feeling more empowered to crack down on those journalists. So we need the support of people to remember and celebrate the fact that fundamentally, we may not always get it right, but fundamentally, journalism is a really important public service that is hugely integral to the health of any functioning society, no matter what country it may be in. So I hope that we can all kind of get on board with remembering that. And obviously as well, if you would like to follow my work, you can follow me on social media at Clarissa Ward CNN on Instagram, or at Clarissa Ward on Twitter, or you can read my book on All Friends. But to me right now, the most important thing is that we celebrate the work and the efforts of journalists instead of constantly disparaging them.
So really great points. We only have another minute or two, unfortunately, as more questions are coming in. This is from our friend Catherine Parr. She's asking, thank you for using your platform to educate and share the cross-cultural education. How can those of us who do not have such an impactful platform support your mission of opening eyes and minds to the commonalities we all share as humans across borders?
Oh, Catherine, it's such a good, first of all, thank you so much for my beautiful gift. But secondly, it's such an important question, and I'm so glad you asked it. And listen, the bottom line is it's about being aware and being curious and being engaged. No one expects you to change the world. And if you think in that sort of daunting way of like, what can I do to impact things? It becomes overwhelming, and you sort of start to say, oh my gosh, there's nothing I can do. I'm only one person, and I'm, living so far away, and blah, blah. Find one small way to have a positive impact on one person's life, whether it's giving to a charity, whether it's having a pen pal, to use a really kind of outdated term, whether it's about listening to the music even of a different place and celebrating that difference or that culture, or taking an interest not necessarily in the whole world, because that becomes overwhelming as well, but maybe one week you're like, I'm going to really take an interest in Yemen this week, and I'm going to read some articles in Yemen. I'm going to watch a movie about Yemen. I'm going to see if there are some talks online that I can watch about Yemen. And then maybe I'm going to give a small amount of money to a charity in Yemen, or sponsor a child, or get involved in some way. And if you bite off a much smaller chunk rather than trying to do the whole thing at once, I find it's much more manageable. And that has been the truth for me as well in my work. In Syria, I was like, I'm going to end the Syrian conflict because I'm going to show the world all the horrors that were happening. No, be humble. That's not the way it's going to happen. The world is a big place. We're small individuals. But if you do it, as they say in Arabic, shway shway, yani, then you can have a positive impact, I believe.
That's such great advice. Another question from a young man in Morocco. Have you ever thought about giving up in moments of doubt? Felt like you can't do it. How did you overcome?
Oh, yeah, for sure. I mean, of course, everyone has those moments of doubt, or moments of feeling that you just don't have the energy, you don't have anything left to give. And that's when I think you have to try to fill up the tank. As I said, you have to, maybe you need to take a break. Maybe you need to take a step away for a moment. Maybe you need to have a long, hard think about why you're feeling so drained, why you're feeling so disillusioned. And then think about ways that you can try to fill the tank, that you can get inspired again, that you can re-energize. And in some cases, it may just be time for a change as well, and a different way to harness your energy, or manifest your goals. And that's okay too.
Clarissa, thank you so much for all of your advice. And I want to thank everyone who's joined us for your questions. This is a great book. I highly recommend it. You can get a copy, an audio version on Kindle or Audible, hard copy at Amazon or your local bookstore, depending on where you live. I also just want to really welcome everyone on this call to engage with Education for Employment. We're growing our community. We need a lot of help to connect youth and women to employment across the MENA region so they can build futures for all the reasons we talked about. Please sign up for our newsletter at efe.org. You can follow us on social media and share content to get the word out, including our current Work for Women campaign. You can volunteer, you can partner with us. Also want to just thank all of our current partners and supporters who are on the line. And we welcome, of course, any financial support like any nonprofit. I'd like to thank all of you for joining us today, and a real special thanks to Clarissa for sharing your time, your insights, your advice to youth in the region, and for your just incredibly courageous and resilient reporting. Thank you
Thank
for
you so
being with
much.
us.
I've loved it. Thank you guys.
Wish we could stay longer, but thank you so much.
Thank you.